So let's talk about Adam Conover's recent show on Netflix, The G Word. I particularly want to talk about the first episode, where Adam Conover glorifies President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's farm subsidies, which sort of begins with a sketch of a Depression-era American farmer talking about how, at the time, roughly 1 in every 4 Americans lived on a farm, and how farmers lost roughly 60% of their income during the Great Depression. And I think it might be helpful to explain how this happened. Economist George Selgin explains that due to government intervention in farming during World War I, crop prices were artificially raised, which was a boon for American farmers at the time. However, shortly after World War I, those crop prices started to come back down, which was especially bad for farmers who had expanded during this time in response to the artificially high prices, many of whom were saddled with a lot of debt due to the expansion heading into the Great Depression. But to make matters worse, when the Great Depression hit, President Herbert Hoover tried his hand at economic planning. What's often left out of the discussion surrounding the Great Depression is how President Herbert Hoover made things worse via government intervention into the economy. Now, Adam Conover, I don't think, mentions Herbert Hoover in this episode, at least I don't remember, but it's often articulated, if not assumed, that Herbert Hoover was this hands-off, laissez-faire president, when in fact the opposite is true. One of President Hoover's key achievements was the passage of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which imposed excessive and expansive taxes on imported goods. The reason why these tariffs were devastating for American farmers was the fact that many countries imposed retaliatory tariffs on U.S. imports into their countries, meaning that American farmers lost a lot of overseas customers. One of those countries that imposed retaliatory tariffs was Canada, and according to an article from CNN from 2016, egg exports to Canada declined from 919,000 dozen boxes in 1929 to under 8,000 dozen boxes by 1932. Perhaps one solution for the struggling farmers was not handouts, but rather tax cuts on imported goods and better trade deals, which the FDR administration, to their credit, did reduce tariffs. More on that later. President Hoover also tried his hand at price controls and subsidies when it came to farming by using the Federal Farm Board to impose a price floor on wheat and cotton in the United States. This would have predictable consequences as farmers reacted by overproducing wheat and cotton, oftentimes at the expense of other crops, knowing that they were at least guaranteed to sell wheat and cotton at a certain price. The Hoover administration would end up spending hundreds of millions of dollars on surplus crops because of these price controls. Even one of FDR's economic advisors, Rexford Tugwell, admitted that much of the New Deal was modeled after what the Hoover administration was already doing. So now we have to talk about the Roosevelt administration, who Adam Conover credits with saving the American farm by suggesting that FDR's farm subsidies led to the tripling of food output from 1948 to today, along with the fact that Americans now spend less of their income on food than any other nation. However, when we look at FDR's Chief Farming Relief Program, which is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, it literally had the opposite impact of what Adam Conover credits it for, as one of the missions of the program was to raise crop prices back to pre-World War I levels. An attempt to solve the problem of farmers making less money and potentially going bankrupt, the AAA literally paid farmers to not grow food, which had predictable consequences like the prices on crops going up and production going down.
That's just not smart.
Again, the opposite of what Adam Conover suggests in his first episode of The G Word. As for saving the American farm, which it did technically help raise the incomes of farmers dramatically, the program also hurts farmers in a variety of ways. One major consequence being unemployment, as the decrease in production led to farmers laying off workers and tenant farmers, and other producers like meat packers and textile companies having to lay off workers due to increased production costs and lower demand for their products. Yeah, you might want to remember this stuff next time some asshat tries to tell you that the New Deal really rescued the American economy.
You absolutely suck!
The increase in crop prices also meant an increase in feeding costs for cattle farmers, some of whom would slaughter cattle to avoid the high cost of feeding, all while other farmers got paid by the government to slaughter pigs in effort to reduce supply, in effort to increase prices. Wow, wasn't Franklin Delano Roosevelt just wonderful, folks?
No, of course not.
American farm output had declined so much that according to Burton Folsom's book, New Deal or Raw Deal,
Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book. Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book.
America temporarily became a net importer of food, a rare feat in American history, as exports decreased due to production declines, all while imports increased. Imagine how much worse things would have been without the reductions on import taxes. Then again, maybe Americans would not have imported as much without FDR paying American farmers to not produce. The Agricultural Adjustment Act would constantly need adjustments and repackaging after facing a variety of Supreme Court challenges, eventually being scrapped in name by 1953, although some of the practices still continued. If you look at the Fred's chart of crop prices during this period, you will notice that the price increases and decreases sort of correlate with the various passages and defeats of the AAA. One of the consequences of attempting to repackage the Agricultural Adjustment Act was the Supreme Court decision Wickard versus Filburn, which gave the federal government more legal authority to regulate individuals and businesses by radically reinterpreting the Commerce Clause, although that's a story for another day. So to recap, Adam Conover credits the New Deal era subsidies for the increased production in food along with the declining prices, when in fact they did the opposite, which was intentional by FDR and congressional Democrats at the time. It might also be worth mentioning that FDR wanted to make this program permanent, as his economic advisor Rexford Tugwell sought to reduce the private ownership of farms.
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
There's also a lot to say about government favors for domestic agriculture in modern times, and how they ultimately result in price increases for American consumers. One notable example being the favors that the U.S. sugar industry receives, which I have talked about before, and my buddy Stephen Michael Davis actually has a pretty good video on this topic in his video about Kim Iverson wanting more corporate welfare. We've also seen how government favors can sometimes result in shortages, like with the baby formula shortage. But even if Adam Conover was correct in his assertion, he still runs into some dilemmas. And to Adam's credit, he does deal with the issue of distortions and perverse incentives that come with subsidies. Although some of the details on his show are a little misleading, like when he shows how a pound of strawberries costs $10 compared to a box of sugary cereal that apparently only costs $1, when in reality Both cost roughly $3 to $5, but I guess it depends where you shop. But one dilemma that I want to address is the issue of pressure group warfare. Adam ends the episode by asking who the government should be acting on behalf of, saying that if it does not work to our benefit, in other words, we the people, it could be a disaster. Adam accepts the government working on behalf of the will of the people as an axiom, but then has to grapple with the variety of conflicts of interest that immediately arise. Notably, when he mentions how the government's mission to help American farmers often gets in the way of helping America's eaters. You'd also think that Adam, recognizing the fact that FDR's farm subsidies excluded ethnic minorities in the United States, might also get him to rethink his premise on whether or not rule by majority is such a wise premise to operate on. Because when the government gets in the business of doling out favors, in this case, farm subsidies, someone is going to have to pay for these favors, and in this case, it's American consumers and taxpayers. Adam Conover's approach to politics therefore necessitates the unavoidable, unresolvable conflicts of interest that he himself highlights and complains about in his show. In other words, the problem is not the variety of concrete, unresolvable conflicts of interest, but rather, the problem is Adam's fundamental premise that the government ought to be used as a tool by we the people to select targets to shake down on behalf of special interest groups. Of course, an alternative to Adam Conover's approach is leaving individuals alone to freely produce and trade with one another for mutual self-benefit, where the government's only role is to punish and remove force from society as best as possible. Anyway, what do you guys think? Do you guys think that your rights and your property and your money should be subject to the whims of the voting majority? Why don't you let me know in the comment section down below?